Welcome to Americana Archives. Today we have part 3 of the story with the headline Underground Railroad Reminiscences. This article was written by H.E. Nottingham. It says that the master would sometimes get pretty close on the trail, is shown by an incident related in a letter received from Peter Richard a few days ago. While the slave owners were searching a house here in Granville, known as an underground station, they stopped on the large porch and debated for some time as to where those slaves were. They felt sure that they were there, but where? After another futile search, they proceeded feeling certain that no slave was about that place. That night, a wagon load of slaves crawled out from under that same porch and proceeded on their journey. This was probably at Edwin Wright's. Another article by Mr. Theophilus Little in the Times of February 24, 1910, gives the following account. In those days of yore, there was an underground railroad running from the Ohio River to Canada, which was built, equipped, and operated solely for the benefit and use of runaway slaves from southern bondage. It was operated without money or price, but absolutely on the pass system. This line passed through the farm of Joseph Little, which joined my father's on the west. On this farm was located an underground station. Uncle Joe Little was the agent, engineer, and conductor. Trains ran only at the dead of dark nights. Many places have been claimed as the birthplace of the Republican Party. Granville was called the damned abolition hole. Abolition was the father, mother too, of the Republican Party. The Republican Party was born on Centerville Street at the Uncle Joe Little Underground Railroad Station. Mr. Henry J. Little of Hope, Kansas, sent the following to the Times on January 3, 1907. One of my early recollections as a boy in Granville is that of the Underground Railway system. When I was a lad of 12 or 14, I remember going with my father, Theophilus Little, up on the Welsh Hills to Gershon Griffiths. There I saw 2 big loads of black refugees who had arrived thus far on their journey north. I called to my mind the way in which the children particularly behaved. They were like little quail, a word from their mother being sufficient to seal their lips and still every motion. They were certainly taught the meaning of silence. It seems that these refugees were to be transferred to the next station, Utica, and my father was to drive one wagon and Uncle Joe Little, I think, the other. It was usual on a trip of this kind to take a boy along whose business it was to throw any curious folks off the scent by cavorting and playing about in the wagon and over the blacks and all who were stowed away in the bottom, so that none would think the contents of the wagon of any special importance. So on this occasion, Edwin Stedman accompanied Uncle Joe, who was his stepfather, and I went with my father. We did not start till after dark Saturday night, and I got back home before daylight Sunday morning. I remember of refugees coming to our house in Centerville, and they would be passed on to other sympathizers sent out from one station to another, and so helped on their route. In later years I married, settled in Harrison Township, and unknowingly got into just such a hotbed again. A slave came to our house one day. I took him to Timothy Thomas's house, he and Obadiah Nichols, his brother-in-law, being leaders in the movement to help the slaves. He was passed on, as had many others. I remember the various trials of the slaves, and attended several meetings where I always would hurrah for the black man. One case in particular was that of a slave who on his way north was arrested in Newark. His master was there armed, and he had also the United States Marshal at hand. By the abolitionists, the trial was set to take place in Granville before Judge Bancroft. He found a flaw in the papers. Before new ones could be made out, the slave was speeding towards Hartford and on, with swift relay of horse to freedom. Henry J. Little and Edwin Stedman, while mere boys, took 2 runaway slaves at night to a station north of here, perhaps Homer or Utica. It was rumored that a rescue was to be attempted by the owner of the slaves. The 4 young men talked the matter over, and the 2 black men swore that they would never be taken alive and would not hesitate to kill their pursuers. They were all well armed, and they agreed to stand by each other if an attack were made. But the stalwart and fearless young fellows were not called upon to display their valor in that way. Samuel J. Langdon had an important station on the southwest corner of Pearl and Summit Streets, the property now owned by Mrs. Kate Hines. Several have referred to this place as a prominent Underground Railroad station. The writer obtained knowledge of only the following incident. For this one he is indebted to Mrs. Hines, who put him on the clue that led to the discovery. She has given also many other helpful suggestions for this paper. A fugitive by the name of Scott got along this far in his dash for liberty and was about overtaken by his pursuers. Mr. Langdon hid the slave in his cellar for 2 weeks or more. Then all danger seemed to be past, so he was taken to Samuel White's farm in the Welsh Hills. There he lived for a while and attended school. Later he came to Granville and learned the cooper's trade with his esteemed benefactor S.J. Langdon. Mr. Scott married and lived here the rest of his life. The year before the World's Fair in Chicago, Mr. Langdon's sons, Albert and Samuel, were visiting Miss Annie White, who lived southwest of Newark. These men wanted to visit their old home in Granville, so the party came over here. While here, they met Mr. Scott. The meeting, as described by Miss White, was very affectionate and touching. The men recalled how when they were mere lads, they fed the black man in the cellar. Mr. Scott remembered them and wept for joy on seeing his boyhood friend once more. The old Ashley Bancroft place mentioned in connection with the abolition meeting was a well-known station. Herbert H. Bancroft, in his Liberty Industries, tells of how he took a trip north. The most brilliant exploit of my life was performed at the tender age of 11, when I spent a whole night in driving a 2-horse wagon load of runaway slaves on their way from Kentucky in slavery to Canada in freedom, an exploit which was regarded in those days by that community with little approbation than that bestowed by a fond Apache mother upon the son who brandishes before his first scalp. The ebony cargo consisted of 3 men and 2 women, who had been brought into town the night before by some teamster of kindred mind to my father's, and kept snugly stowed away from prying eyes during the day. About 9 o'clock at night, the large lumber box wagon filled with straw was brought out, and the black dissenters from the American Constitution, who so lightly esteemed our glorious land of freedom, were packed under the straw, and some blankets and sacks thrown carelessly over them, so that outwardly there might be no significance of the dark and hidden meaning of the load. My careful mother bundled me in coats and scarves to keep me from freezing, and with a round of goodbyes, given not without some apprehensions for my safety, and with minute instructions, repeated many times lest I should forget them, I climbed to my seat, took the reins, and drove slowly out of town. Once or twice I was hailed by some curious passerby with, "What have you got there?" to which I made answer as in such case had been provided. Just what the answer was I have forgotten, but it partook somewhat of the flavor of my mission, which was more in the direction of the law of God than of the law of man. Without telling an adulterated Ananias and Sapphira lie, I gave the inquirer no very reliable information. Still, most of the people in that vicinity understood well enough what the load meant, and were in sympathy with the shippers. I was much nearer danger when I fell asleep and ran the wagon against a tree near a bank, over which my load narrowly escaped being turned. The fact is, this was the first time in my life I had ever attempted to keep my eyes open all night, and more than once, as my horse jogged along, I was brought to my senses by a jolt, and without any definite idea of the character of the road for some distance back. My freight behaved very well. Once fairly out into the country and into the night, the slaves straightened up, grinned, and appeared to enjoy the performance hugely. During the night they would frequently get out and walk, always taking care to keep carefully covered in passing through town. About 3 o'clock in the morning I entered a village and drove up to the house whither I had been directed, roused the inmates, and transferred to them my load. Then I drove back, sleepy but happy. Mr. Chapin was a student here during the years of 1845 to 1851. He does not recall any Granville experiences in regard to the Underground Railroad, but says that there were very many, perhaps 100 Southern boys here in school at that time, thus showing a great reason why there was such great secrecy practiced in connection with the Underground Railroad station. He told about an interesting trial that took place in Bellefontaine, where he was teaching at the time. Perhaps there is another account of this elsewhere, but the following is Mr. Chapin's recollection of the incident. Don Pyle lived at Covington, Kentucky. On Election Day in 1852, he became intoxicated, and his slaves considered that then was a good time to take a trip to Canada. One old slave, a young fellow, and a woman about 25, slipped out and went to Cincinnati, where they boarded the train for the north on the Mad River and Lake Erie Railroad, the first railroad in the state. At West Liberty, they were intercepted by Judge Piatt, brother of Don Piatt, who had telegraphed that 3 of his slaves had run away. To be continued. Tune back in soon for the next installment of this incredible story. This story came from the great state of Ohio, being reported in the Granville Times of January 18th, 1912. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.